The challenge of tonight's topic, as was in most topics which I gave until now, is to be able to condense such a vast topic into a very, very short time. And again, those who want to ask questions, I hope to leave time for questions, can put it in the chat, and Rabbi Aaron Sirota will moderate. He will ask the questions and I will attempt to answer them. I'm hoping also in the future to be able to dedicate more time to questions, and we'll have a system where questions could be sent in advance, and we can dedicate the line portion of each session answering questions. The question of fertility, generally and specifically how it affects Jewishness and Jewish status. The challenge of fertility is something that affected mankind from the very, very beginning. And if we open up the Torah, the Bible, will see how the founders of our people, many of them had to go through the trauma of being childless. We have Abraham and Sarah, Rivka and Isaac, Rochel, later on Hannah, who gave birth to Prophet Samuel. And, we see that's something that affected mankind from time immemorial. But specifically in last decades, we see that the science of fertility achieved certain incredible achievements, which are, on one hand, allowed couples to have children when they couldn't and they weren't able to achieve this before. And at the same time, as everything else in life, they brought about many ethical and religious questions. And in Judaism, ethical and religious are not two separate entities, they one and the same, because our ethics is our religion. And I want to say that apart from the fact that I will analyze certain areas of what we're going to talk about, but I think it's so important to emphasize every single time that all decisions and the outlook of our Torah, our sages, and Halacha, Jewish law, always is based on the primary sources. It's not just some rabbi got up one morning and decided that this is proper, this is ethical, and this is unethical. Every single decision, every single opinion has a precedent which could be found in the original sources, which is quite hard for some people to imagine. You're talking about something like we spoke a few weeks ago about DNA, and I tried to show how even DNA, which is such a new science, how the subject at hand found its way in a Talmud and the codes. And I'll try to show the same thing this time also. So what are some of the techniques of fertility that came about? The oldest was artificial insemination, which later became known as IUI, more sophisticated. And that's something which, whenever there was a certain barrier, a certain problem of achieving conception and pregnancy through normal relationship, they found that sometimes you can bypass certain barriers by injecting the sperm into the uterus. That's one particular method. It's all classified as ART, assisted reproductive techniques. In 1978, a doctor called a professor, a specialist called Robert Edwards, achieved the first birth of a child born from IVF, in vitro fertilization. It was called, in those days, they used almost like a science fiction term, test tube babies. In fact, it wasn't a test tube, it was on a petri dish, but that's how they used to call it. And the first woman, called Louise Brown, was born. She's still alive and well. She has children of her own, probably grandchildren, but possibly, I don't think she has grandchildren, only children. What is IVF? I'm sure everybody knows, but I'll say in 2 minutes because some of the details are important for our discussion tonight. IVF basically is when there's a particular problem, either female or male. A female problem could be anything like blocked fallopian tubes, or sometimes lack of 1 or 2 fallopian tubes. Sometimes it's a male factor when there's a certain lacking in the quality of sperm. It could be either count or motility or morphology, different certain problems within the sperm, and pregnancy can be achieved in a regular way. And even IUI, even the insemination will not help. So what takes place is that a woman is stimulated, and at a certain point her eggs are taken out by, it's a procedure. On the same day, in a scientific language, it's called day 0, the eggs are being inseminated by sperm, and there are 2 ways how to do it. One way is the original IVF, when it was put on a dish and the sperm basically fertilized the eggs, and the other way is called ICSI, which is the micro injection. The first child born from ICSI was born in 1992. And this specifically helps with the male factor, because sometimes the quality of sperm is so poor that even IVF will not help. And what is done is a single sperm is being even, a healthy ejaculation could be 100 million cells of sperm, or 50 million is still considered to be quite good. But when you get to 10 million, it's already considered quite low. What happens if it's not 10 million, but 10? Not even 10,000 or 100, but 10. ICSI could allow for a creation of an embryo, to fertilization of an egg, and pregnancy and birth. So ICSI allowed, it's another form of IVF, it allowed to achieve and to bypass the fertility challenge when until now even regular IVF couldn't do it. So on day 0, either IVF or ICSI takes place, and then depending on the specific policy of a lab or the clinic or specific philosophy of the particular institution, either on day 3 or today usually on day 5, the embryo is transferred into the uterus of the mother, hoping for a successful pregnancy and ultimately birth. That is IVF. Now, what are some of the challenges? Why is it? We know that all different religions started to discuss it and see, is it allowed, it's not allowed, and for different reasons there's problems with it. In Judaism, it's very simple. People ask a question, how can you play God? How can you suddenly decide that this particular couple were able to have children, and if they're not meant to have kids, then don't start to play around with nature. But that's not the Jewish attitude, because the way Yiddishkeit looks at it, the way the Torah looks at it, is that just like a doctor has not only permission, but he has the divine mission, and he's almost like a messenger of God to be able to heal. And we don't say that if somebody is sick, well, if you're meant to live, you're going to live. If you're meant to die, you're going to die. We don't say that. We go to doctors, and a doctor is using all of his medical knowledge to be able to assist the patient in any possible way. And the more knowledge we have and the more advanced the science of medicine is, the greater amount of assistance to the patient and the greater amount of ability to save lives. And that is why Yiddishkeit never ever looked at a concept of going to doctors as something negative. On the contrary, it says, V'rape yirape, the doctor has a divine mission to heal, and part of our responsibility is that we have to be able to go to doctors if the situation demands. And the same thing applies to any assistance of science in any area of life. But then, so therefore, the whole concept of trying to somehow disqualify these methods because we are playing God, that's something which is not accepted by Jewish thought, by the Torah. But at the same time, we look at the substantive questions. What could go wrong? What are the areas where we have to be able to see if it's okay and if it's not okay, or maybe how to make it okay? In other words, sometimes there are challenges in Halacha and Jewish law, but we are able to find solutions to them. So from the very beginning, there was a great amount of discussion about all of these methods. And I'll give you just one particular question that came up. And I'll show you how the most modern technique has its sources in the Talmud and the codes. One of the questions came up is the a pregnancy and birth achieved not through regular relationship. How does it affect the parenthood of the father, for example? Okay, the mother is, she becomes pregnant, she carries the child, she's obviously the mother. But what about the father? Is he considered to be the father if there was no relationship, there was no intercourse? Everything happened synthetically. And as modern as the question may seem, but it's actually is discussed in a code, it's discussed in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law. It's discussed in a Talmud when it's talking about a pregnancy without intercourse. It happened before. There was a story with Jeremiah the prophet, how his son was born. His son was born without. There was, his wife, the mother of the child, conceived from the semen, which didn't come from intercourse. So these things happened before. Just 1 second. We have a technical problem over here. The discussion whether or not the father has a paternal connection to the child and whether the father can fulfill the mitzvah, the biblical commandment of Pru Revu, of having children. There's actually a biblical commandment to have children. Whether or not you can fulfill it through IUI or IVF, it's something which is discussed in the codes long before IUI and IVF came into the picture. And the consensus of poskim, based on the primary sources, that indeed the father remains the father, and the fulfillment of the biblical commandment to have children can be done through those methods when it's impossible to achieve them through regular intercourse. What are some other challenges? There are too many to discuss over here. I'm going to take just one particular example. I mean, there's so many questions that come up to do with Shabbos, because all of these methods, they take place a number of days. So from day 0 to day 5, it's already 6 days over here. So what is permitted to do on Shabbos? What is not permitted to do on Shabbos? How does it affect the laws of family purity, the laws of niddah, the laws of, there's laws of to do with the mikveh. Can a embryo be placed on a woman when she's in a state of niddah, before she goes to mikveh, for example? All those questions are discussed, and they were part of our protocol, halachic protocol, which we created. Originally, a close colleague and a relative of mine, with whom I work very closely, we both considered to be like the address for those sort of questions. So in 1991, Rabbi Fegelstock created a protocol based on a discussion that the Lubavitcher Rebbe had with some rabbis who tried to send him their rulings that he should agree to halachic IVF. And the only one that actually got a positive answer was Rabbi Fegelstock. And based on his ruling, I've put together a very comprehensive protocol, which I enhance and add on constantly, because methods changed, even though it's all called IVF or it's called ICSI, but methods keep on changing, and therefore you have to be able to account for those changes, include them in the protocol. Already back in the early 90s, I would say back in 1995, or mid-90s rather, we've made a connection with all the major clinics in Sydney. Sydney was one of the pioneering places in the world to start halachic IVF. It was actually dubbed by the clinics kosher IVF. It wasn't a name given by myself, it was a name given by them. So we've created this protocol, and we created a very, very beautiful working relationship with all of those clinics. And we had since then hundreds and hundreds of children born as a result of that protocol. And this protocol later on I've used to create similar systems all around the world. We have, for example, places like, I visited over the years, places like Panama, Venezuela, Chicago. The latest one, which is the prestigious Cornell Clinic, is for the last 4 or 5 years under my supervision. And all of, it basically runs according to our protocol. And together with that, many of my students adopted, for example, in Melbourne, it runs on the same, the rabbi who runs it there, he uses the same protocol. In South Africa, the whole of South Africa, including Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Cape Town, is a student of mine that actually lived for a while in Australia, and back in the 90s, I've trained him in that particular area. And today, all of those places use our protocol. One of the main areas of the protocol, the way it affects not just the rabbi and the couple and the instructions we give to the couple, but the actual clinic, is a question of hashgacha, of supervision, halachic supervision. We know that even though presumably there has to be certain trust with the clinic that you're working with, because if there's no trust, there's no working relationship. But at the same time, according to the law, there's a limit to how much we're allowed to trust them. In other words, there is a concept, the idea of conflict of different positions existed in Judaism long before it existed in other places. For example, in Jewish law, if you have a great rabbi, let's take Moses, for example. Nobody's trusted more than Moses. If somebody like Moses is trusted explicitly, if he would buy his own butcher shop and you become the owner of the butcher shop, you would need a separate mashgiach, a separate supervisor to be able to look over it, because it becomes a conflict. Even though some people are above those conflicts and they wouldn't suspect them that they would fail, but nevertheless, it exists in Jewish law. It exists in secular society also, but definitely in Jewish law. So we cannot have the same organization, the medical and the embryological establishment within each clinic, to whose whole mission is to be able to achieve success. We have to have a separate supervision, which is accountable to the rabbi, who is the halachic authority over that particular place, to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And the reality is that it's not something which is in the world of fantasy. It's something that happened throughout the years. If anybody will Google, for example, Dr. Jacobson or Dr. Ash. Dr. Ash, it says over here, if you Google him, it says obstetrician, gynecologist, fugitive, something like this. It gives you a few other things, but he was a scientist who basically took eggs from women and put them, used them to make embryos to put in other women. So there's at least 15 women that we know of that were impregnated by genetic material not their own. Later on, he ran away, he was arrested. He got off on double jeopardy. It's a very interesting story. There was another doctor called Dr. Jacobson who used his own sperm to father at least 75 kids without women knowing that he's doing it. These people have to be sick, and not everybody is sick, but at the same time, we are not permitted by Jewish law to allow for either mistakes to happen, and mistakes do happen not so often, but they do happen. And we can't allow for even a possibility of any malicious mishandling. That's not allowed by Jewish law. We can't say, look, this clinic we trust, and this clinic we don't trust. So the protocol contains within itself a hashgacha, a level of supervision, where from the very beginning, when a sperm is brought to the lab on day 0, from the time that the eggs are being extracted, retrieved from the woman, all of this is being observed by a trained mashgicha, which we have in every single place. We have trained supervisors. For any intimate female supervision, obviously female supervisors have to take place, and sometimes when there's a male intimate procedure, such as macrotessi, when a sperm has to be extracted from a testicle, when even ICSI, sometimes the husband is asospermic, he has no sperm at all, even one cell of sperm doesn't come out in the semen, and then you have to be able to use very invasive procedure. For this you need a male supervisor, and at no stage is the genetic material remains unattended. It's either always under the eyesight of the supervisor, or it's being sealed in an incubator. And later, when you freeze the embryos, because what happens is that you try to produce as many eggs as possible and fertilize as many as possible and have as many embryos as possible, but you can only transfer one embryo at a time, usually maximum 2. So you freeze all the other ones in order to be able to have later on what's called frozen cycles, which are much, much easier physically, emotionally, financially, and but all of these things, they must have supervision. In a liquid nitrogen tanks, everything is sealed, and at no stage at all, even for 1 second, does the genetic material leave the eyesight of the supervisor, and unless it's sealed in the incubator, which is a double seal, like it's done in the strictest form of kashrus. If we are so careful about meat and wine, how much more so we careful about our children? So that is something which is important for the status of a child, because what happens if the embryo is mixed, if it's somebody else's embryo and so on and so forth, that becomes a question which we'll discuss very soon. Now, this is a regular IVF, and if it's done properly, then there's no question. Obviously, the job of the rabbi, is not just, a rabbi is also a fertility specialist. He doesn't just supervise IVF. When couples come to us, a lot of times we can help them with certain advice that will preempt using IVF and similar processes, because a lot of times, especially in certain places, we know the doctors, they are impatient. For example, there's a particular clinic in Manhattan that almost immediately, like any couple that is infertile for a year, they will push them to do IVF. And sometimes there are other ways and means how to achieve it. And I would say that most of my time is spent to try to help couples not to have to go through IVF. But if it's a very clear diagnosis, and it's quite obvious that according to laws of nature, you will be either impossible or highly unlikely to achieve natural pregnancy, then we would encourage the couple to go through IVF. And we would do it halachically correct, so then there's no question about the permissibility of this particular process. Now we come to a more complicated question, the question of partnership. This all happens if there is a certain barrier, an impediment for a couple to achieve pregnancy, conception pregnancy, not only through intercourse, and therefore they have to come on to IVF, but sometimes even IVF between the husband and the wife is naturally impossible. And there are two reasons for it. One reason is when it's a male factor, actually three reasons, and two reasons when it's a female factor. The male factor means that the husband is so azoospermic that even an invasive procedure such as microtesy, when you literally go inside a testicle and you take out tissue and macroscopically look for sperm, nothing is found. It happens sometimes. And in such a case, scientifically, and I want to say that first we'll describe the scientific method, and then we'll see whether it's permissible in Jewish law, and afterwards whether not only if it's permissible, but if it's done, what are the consequences? Because not every question is a question whether you can do it or not. Some questions are, it's done, what do we do now? So the question is, which was spoken about, it was a very big polemic in 1970s, or even 60s. Then it was much more complicated. There were very few cases when there was any problem on a male factor that could be achieved without looking into a sperm donor. Today, there are exceptions, but they still exist. So the question is, if it's absolutely impossible to be able to use the husband's sperm to impregnate his wife, can a sperm donor be used? The general answer is that it's not something that is encouraged in Halacha for many reasons, because it clouds the yichus, the status, and the where the person comes from. But it was debated in the 60s and the 70s in the following way. Will the sperm donor produce a mamzer, an illegitimate child? Because you have a married woman and she is impregnated, she's inseminated with a sperm of a foreign man. So the question was, number one, can you do it all together? And if it's done already, even post factum, what are the results? And then there was a very big debate. Moshe Feinstein, who was a great halachic decisor, he created waves in the Jewish world by saying that even though he's not for it too much, he doesn't advocate for it, but he says in an impossible situation where there's a depression and real trauma in a family, one can use a non-Jewish donor. Why non-Jewish donor? Not because if you remember last week's lecture, or I think a lecture 2 weeks ago actually, we spoke about a question of a mamzer. We spoke about the fact that a mamzer can only be born from a Jewish father. If it's a non-Jewish father, even though it could be a case of adultery and forbidden relationship, but a non-Jewish father cannot produce a mamzer. At that time, there was a very big debate. Can you have a mamzer without intercourse? There were great scholars who argued that yes, that even without husband and wife being together, if you just impregnate somebody with somebody else's sperm, if the owner of the sperm is a Jew, the results are, even though technically it's not adultery because there was no intercourse, but the results are that the child is a mamzer. That was the opinion of a number of scholars, including the late Satmar Rebbe and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was a great halachic decisor who passed away in 1995. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and many others argued that it wouldn't produce a mamzer. And he brought very strong proofs. And I must say that even though I usually would try to accommodate both views, not to create a polemic about the status of a child, but in this case, I would also avoid a situation when a child is a mamzer, even according to some opinions. But in retrospect, I feel very strongly that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was correct. I'm not going to go in all of the halachic proof, but I think his argument is very compelling. And I would certainly rule that post factum, if it happened, the child is not a mamzer. However, he argued that the donor should be a non-Jew for a different reason. He said that even though there's no question of being a mamzer, but if you have a Jewish donor, there's a possibility of later on a brother marrying a sister. Because the donor could be a donor for a number of women. And later on, if they have the same Jewish father, it's considered incest in Jewish law. And for that reason, he advocated that in a situation when you would do it, you should do it without using a non-Jewish donor rather than a Jewish donor. That was his opinion, and it makes a lot of sense. There was a very interesting nuance that a particular religious person in Israel, a case that I know personally, he actually got permission to use a sperm donor, and he requested to do it through IVF and to do what's called PGD. PGD we'll discuss very soon. It's interesting. PGD is the ability today to test, to biopsy the embryo and test the cell in order to be able to see different genetic problems. So he says that he wants to be able to do PGD in order to have a girl instead of a boy. Why? Usually we know that we don't allow PGD just to choose gender. That's not ethical and not allowed in Jewish religion either. In other words, when a child can conceive a child normally, but they go through IVF just in order because they want a son, for example. That's not permitted. That's not justified. We'll talk about PGD, which poses many ethical problems if we have time later on today. But the reason why this particular individual wanted a girl, because he is a Kohen. And once you have a donor, then the child goes after the father, and the Kohen status goes after the male, not the female. So he knew that if he will have a boy, it's almost like publicizing to everybody that it's not his child, because the child wouldn't be able to be a Kohen, and he wouldn't be able to be called up to the Torah as a Kohen. And therefore, to avoid embarrassment for himself, he wanted to ask for permission to have a girl, because with a girl, nobody would know that she's a Kohen or not a Kohen. That doesn't really matter. And that's a very, very interesting nuance over here. I want to go to the very, very polemic question, very interesting question, which I would say it's probably one of the most undecided questions in Jewish law. And this is a question of partnership with motherhood, in motherhood. So when it comes to a father, ultimately, whether it's permitted or forbidden, once we know who the mother is, the child is Jewish. There could be certain other questions coming up, but the actual status of a child remains as is. With the women, it's in a way more complicated. Women have two separate reproductive systems. They have no connection to each other. A man has only one. A woman has two. One of them is genetic, and that is the ovaries and eggs, which contain the DNA. And the other one is the uterus and the ability to carry pregnancy and to give birth. They're two separate systems completely. And sometimes one works and the other one doesn't work. So we have cases of women that have either what's called a ovarian failure syndrome, when the quality of the eggs and the actual reservoir of eggs is really diminishing, and they cannot have children naturally. Sometimes it even becomes premature menopause. We had a woman who had a menopause at the age of 16, 17. And for this woman, it's impossible. By the time she got married, she had no eggs whatsoever. So for her, it's impossible to be able to have her own eggs. The only way, again, I'm first talking scientifically before I discuss it religiously. So scientifically, the solution which modern science offers is to find another woman and to say, you know what, you will donate your eggs, and we'll do exactly the same as a regular IVF, except instead of using the husband's sperm to fertilize the eggs of the mother, of the wife, I apologize, it fertilizes, we use it to fertilize the egg or the eggs of the donor, and then transfer the embryo where the father is the husband, but the owner of the egg, the genetic mother, so to speak, is a different woman, and to place it in the uterus, and the one who carries the child is the wife. So she's the birth mother. That's one particular scenario. Another scenario is when the genetic component system works perfectly. The woman has perfect ovaries and perfect eggs and a very big supply of eggs. Everything is good. She could technically fertilize the eggs, but she had a hysterectomy. She doesn't have a uterus, or the lining of the uterus doesn't allow for the pregnancy to be viable. So what is such a lady to do? Again, scientifically, what science offers today is to have what's called a surrogate mother. Surrogate mother means a woman that is basically you achieve through IVF a regular embryo where the husband and the wife are the father and the mother of the embryo. And then you take the embryo and you transfer it into the uterus of the surrogate mother. She carries the child for 9 months and she gives birth to the child. The two questions are obvious, like everything else. Are you allowed to do it? And if it's done, who is the mother? Is the mother the one that carried the child for 9 months and gave birth? Or it's the mother that the child has DNA? The child looks like her, you test the DNA, looks like the mother. Now, before I will go into that question, I want to say that when we talk about permissibility, it's a complicated question, and many scholars don't allow it, also for the reason that it distorts. If it's a non-Jewish partner, it creates a question in the Jewishness, which we'll discuss soon. And if it's a Jewish mother, it still creates a question of who does the child belong to, who is the real mother. And because of the Judaism is very concerned with clarity of status and clarity where we come from, there are many scholars who wouldn't allow it. When I had a chance over the years to speak to groups of young ladies who are not married, I often recommended they should freeze the eggs under hashgocha, under supervision. And that's something which is allowed. And this will avoid, I once spoke to a group of young women who were in their 30s, and they were concerned that they still haven't found the partner in life and the marriage partner. And they were concerned about the fact that by the time that they will find a partner, the biological clock is ticking. What's considered young in society is considered already not so young. When a woman is 39 years old, it's considered very young according to all social criteria. When it comes to fertility, unfortunately it's already not considered young. The chances are getting lower and lower. So I've recommended many times to freeze the eggs, and the worst that can happen is, or maybe the best that can happen is, you won't have to use them because you'll be able to have a child naturally still. But in a situation where the woman already will not have the ability to have fresh eggs in a natural relations, she'll be able to use those eggs, because once you freeze eggs successfully, they don't become old. So if somebody froze the eggs at the age of 32, they'll be able to have a very successful pregnancy at the age of 40, 41, 42, 43, because the uterus can work much, much later than the genetic part, and that's why it would help them. But that's the question of where they can do it. But the reality is that many people are doing it anyway because they really suffer of being childless. And many of them will do it. It's just a question of guiding them to do it in a way that will cause the least problems for the child and make sure the child is the status is not questioned and not challenged. So the question is, who is the mother? And like I said before, if from Halacha perspective, it's unresolved. I'm going to give you some background at the moment. I wish I could ask all of you what you think, because whenever I talk to audiences and I ask people, who do you think is the mother? If you will have to decide, it's 50-50. And I must tell you that whenever you have a situation where it's a real couple that either had a child through a surrogate mother or through an egg donor, it's unthinkable for them to think in any other way. Whenever we have a situation where you have a couple that used a surrogate mother, so the wife, who is the genetic mother, she would say, what do you mean? That's my egg, it's my DNA, the child looks like me. You're going to say it's not my child? But when you have the opposite situation, when you have a couple that the woman couldn't have a genetic child because she didn't have the ovaries, or she didn't have the eggs anymore, and they had a surrogate mother, and they had an egg donor, I apologize, and the actual wife carried the child for 9 months, she will say, listen, what are you talking about? Of course I'm the mother. I carry the child, I give birth to a child. So we don't talk about from the perspective, when I talk to couples and explain the issues to them, I say, of course you're the mother. It doesn't matter whether you carry the child or you used your eggs. Once you have a unit, you have a husband and a wife, and they had a child in one of those ways, of course you're the mother. But the question is, who is the halachic mother to whom the child is connected as far as the status is concerned? If one of the mothers is not Jewish, doesn't matter whether it's a carrying mother, the birth mother, or the genetic mother. Is the child Jewish? Who does he follow? And again, the opinions that range from two extremes and many middle grounds, they all are based on primary sources. Nobody comes along and says, listen, of course that's the mother because it makes sense to me. Everybody brings halachic arguments. And over the years I've studied all of those arguments. They range from, if I were to simplify it to you, I'll give you 5 opinions. That's a simplified version of it. The 2 extreme opinions are black and white. One opinion says, yes, it's only the birth mother, and one says only the genetic mother. That's very, very few authorities hold this way. Then you have an opinion of a great decisor, the same Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who at the end of the day, he said, and I heard this from many, many of his students, he said that it's the only question that he has that he can't come to a decision. And he says every single argument that you'll bring in one way, he'll find an equally good argument the other way. And I'll give you an example. One of the arguments that you can use for a genetic mother being the mother is the fact that the Talmud tells us that if a woman is going through conversion and she's pregnant and she converts while she's pregnant, the Talmud says that the child who is born doesn't have to go through a separate conversion. The child automatically, the mikveh that converted the mother also helps the child. And the Talmud and the codes discuss different reasons why that's the case, but whichever way you look at it, this particular Talmud seems to indicate that it's the conception that forms the status and not the birth. Because if it would be in the birth, it would be irrelevant whether the mikveh worked for the child or not. Doesn't matter. By the time the child is born, the mother is Jewish, and therefore it should be no question. The fact that the Talmud says it is a question, and the conversion of the mikveh that converted the mother can also work for the child, that is already an indication that it seems to be the genetic mother to be the mother. But I would argue differently. I would say that even if you will take that position, there's still a very strong argument the other way around also, to say that it's the birth mother. And the argument is that, I'm not going to bring all of the sources, but there's a very strong argument that even if you say that the status of a child goes to conception and not to birth, you can argue that the conception begins in the uterus and not on a petri dish. And therefore, you can see I've given you just two primary sources. There's many, many more, but I've given you just an idea of how much goes into it and how debatable the topic is. I'll give you another interesting thought. Even if you would argue that ultimately the mother who determines the status of the child is the birth mother, and the child actually is connected to her, you can still argue that if the egg donor was a non-Jew, the child needs to be converted. And the argument is as follows. Just like we said before, that the reason why an embryo is born Jewish when the pregnant mother converted while the embryo was inside, and if she wouldn't convert, if she wouldn't go to mikveh with the embryo wouldn't become Jewish. Similarly, we can say that when the conception is from a non-Jewish mother, and there was no in the middle, then it was put into a Jewish mother, and the Jewish mother didn't go to the mikveh because she's Jewish. So therefore, the embryo wasn't Jewish, and the embryo never had a chance to convert. So there's a very strong argument that if the egg donor, whichever way you look at it, if the egg donor is from a non-Jewish, if the egg donor is not Jewish, then the child needs to be converted. I've spoken about the subject very, very, very much. I was invited last year, before the whole Corona situation, we could still travel. I was within 1 month, I was invited to speak at a rabbinical conference of European rabbis in Belgium, in Antwerp, on that subject. And literally 2 months later, I received a call from the chief rabbi of Israel, and he asked me to come. They have a yearly conference of all the dayanim, of all the judges of Israel. It's like the elite of the rabbinic world of Israel. And he asked me to speak on 2 topics. One of them was on this topic, and I'll explain to you in which context. And another one on the topic to do with divorces, when it's impossible to achieve a authorization of a divorce by husband except through internet, and how to do it properly. So I spoke on these 2 subjects. My daughter was getting married right after this particular conference. So I told the chief rabbi that it's very hard for me to come because, by the time I come back, it's almost going to be the chasana, the wedding. So he said that the conference is 3 days. It's on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, and I should pick a day and an hour when I will speak. And I came together with my son-in-law, Rabbi Eli Schlanger. We went for 24 hours to Israel. We arrived on Monday morning, and Tuesday morning went back. And I've spoke about the subject, and specifically the reason why I went, because I felt very strongly to explain 2 particular fundamental questions in this particular subject. One question is that even though all of the dayanim, all of these judges are great scholars, and each one has his own opinion, and each one, some of them very strongly believe one way. They believe that the birth mother is the mother. The other one believes that the genetic mother is the mother. I wanted to show that it really is impossible to be able to there will actually, if we'll make a decision to ignore one of the possibilities, will actually disadvantage the child, because according to many opinions and legitimate opinions, his status will be questioned. And therefore we can't afford to be able just to decide on our opinion, no matter how strong it may be. We've taken into account the larger picture, and I brought proofs to show how either way could be an arguable, a legitimate argument. And the other one was a much more controversial topic that is still not fully decided in Israel, but I think that this particular conference was a very decisive factor to push it in the right direction. We spoke last week about the about conversions. And I discussed how the conversion of minors, of little children, is very different to conversion of adults. With adults, there has to be an acceptance of the commandments. With a child, that is impossible. A 2-year-old child, a 1-year-old child, a 3-year-old child is not mature enough to accept the commandments. And therefore, there has to be what's called in the Talmud schus. You have to merit the child. It has to be merit for him. And there is a very big debate what level of observance has to be at home in order for the child to be merited to be Jewish. If a child is brought up in a Jewish home with all of the traditions and everything else, part of his life, then it's considered to be a schus, a merit for him. But if the child will become, so to speak, converted, and he will be torn away and he live in a simulated home, that's not considered to be a schus. And that's something which is accepted. There's argument among scholars what level of observance has to be in order to make it a schus for the child. But my argument was, and I wrote since then quite a number of responses which were already published in certain books and publications, that the conversion of a child born from when one mother is Jewish and the other one is not, for example, either the genetic mother or the carrying mother is Jewish but the other mother is not, it's very different to a regular child who's adopted. For a number of reasons, and I don't want to go into it right now because I want to finish early to allow for some questions. But the two main arguments is first of all that a child who will not be converted in such a case, for him will be the opposite of a merit. It'll be greatest liability because he's going to be in no man's land. On one hand, he's a possible Jew, and therefore he's still obligated in the commandments. On the other hand, until his status is verified, you cannot accept him as you can marry him, you can't give him bar mitzvah, you can't call him to the Torah, and so on and so forth. So his position is the most precarious and unsettled, and therefore for him it will be absolute merit to take away the lack of clarity of his status and to make sure that he is Jewish. That's number one. And number two, it's a tremendous liability for the community, because what happens today is that in Israel alone, you have over 1,000 children born every year from non-Jewish egg donors, and nobody knows about it because they are being recorded. The rabbinate doesn't know about it, and they're being recorded in Misrad Apnim, in the Ministry of Interior, as Jews. Nobody knows even that they're born from an egg donor. And when they grow up, they're going to conduct marriages for these children. And for that reason, I argued, number one, that if people feel that the rabbinate is unapproachable, they won't come forward, they won't reveal it. And it'll be tremendous confusion in the Jewish statuses. But if they will know that the rabbinate has a very clear policy on that, people will come forward and try to rectify it. And on the way, there's a very famous Jewish philanthropist and a scholar in California called Rabbi Tzvi Reisman, who actually, because of him, I wrote on the subject. I already had a policy on this question maybe over 20 years ago from rabbis, and we helped a tremendous amount of rabbis, especially in America, where there's no organized rabbinate, to be able to help them with kids born from surrogate mothers and from non-Jewish egg donors. But I never wrote about the subject, and he was the one that motivated. He wrote to me an actual question, and because of him, I wrote on the subject, and he publicized my response in a publication where he asked maybe 30 other rabbis. And I only saw this publication on a day when I left Israel, when he sent it to me first on PDF on my phone, and I looked at it and I saw that the chief rabbi is of a different opinion to me, that he is not in agreement with me. But I thought, listen, I have to, and I'm going to be presenting in front of him. But after my presentation, I believe that probably 95% of rabbis did agree, and the chief rabbi told me that he will try to implement the policy as presented by myself. So that was in itself was worthwhile 24 hours to be able to go into it. I will conclude over here. I was going to discuss PGD and how it affects all different facets of life. Trying to have a certain type of child, when it's allowed, when it's not allowed. How can you use it in which kind of possible medical issues you can use it? For example, BRCA, to try to eradicate BRCA from the family. I don't know if you heard about BRCA gene, and so on and so forth. But that I'll leave for a different topic. And you can, if anybody has questions, we can ask questions. But I want to conclude that the reason why, in the very beginning, when the question came up in the early 21st century, I had to make a decision how to approach those subjects when couples come and want to be able to discuss a possible question of either surrogacy or egg donor. And even though it's not clear at all that it's an ideal situation, but what motivated me to be able to deal with it and not to be able to tell people that it's not allowed to ignore it, because I realized, and I saw it in the living example, that if you will take that approach, couples will just do the wrong thing without asking, and the results are catastrophic. At least if you allow them to come forward and you work together with them and you guide them, then we're able to achieve that the child who is born will have a status without any question, Jewish status. And I recall that probably 10 years ago, I had a discussion with a very prominent rabbi in America who was at the time the main halachic decisor for an organization called A-Time. It's a very large organization that deals with infertility. It's an ultra-Orthodox organization. And he spoke very, very negatively about any kind of donors. And he told me a story that happened to him, that in his ultra-Orthodox community in Borough Park, he found out that there was a couple that gave birth to a child with a non-Jewish egg donor. And when he found out about it, he called them over and he gave them over the head, and then he converted the child. And I said to him, respectfully, I said that he was very fortunate that he found out about it. But there could be many other cases that he doesn't know about, because if we make a policy that it's not negotiable and we don't discuss it, we don't allow it, the couples will, in desperation to have a child, will go behind our backs and make their own way and make their own decisions, and ultimately without the knowledge of how to make sure that the child will be born. And ultimately for us, the most important thing is clarity. We don't, like I said many times, the Jewish religion doesn't look down on anybody else. If somebody is born Jewish, he has to uphold his Jewish responsibility. If somebody was born non-Jewish, until they convert to Judaism, and they don't have to convert, but if they continue to be righteous members of the human race, they are close to God, they're loved by God, but at the same time, there always has to be this very clear knowledge of who is who. Without it, that's how God created the world and how God wants the world to run. This is my presentation for today. It's a very, very sort of general overview. If anybody has any questions, are there other questions? Okay, so we have questions over here.
All right, question number 1. If there is permission for a sperm donor, is there any Yerusha inheritance issues for that child? I.e., does the child have to make a claim on the sperm donor or the person's husband?
Right. The question is an excellent question, by the way, and I will not answer it in its totality because it's time will not permit me. I want to say that it depends on a number of issues. It depends on a question of who is raising the child, who is actually is the father in a sense of. In other words, if there was a donor and not a bank donor, according to all of the legalities today, he doesn't have to. He can basically find a way where he will not be liable to be able to give inheritance to any of his biological kids when he didn't raise them. So in a nutshell, it's usually will go to the father that raised the child, not to the donor. There are some exceptions depending on the situation, but that's the usual case.
All right. What would be the decision of a Beis Din if a surrogate at birth will decide to keep the baby as hers? A secular court allowed this despite the genetic material was from both parents. Surely it is very much dependent on the individual situation, but just wondering what would be the instinctive answer.
Right. In the very embryonic stages of this whole situation, when if you want to Google and see what happened in the 70s, it's true that there were surrogate mothers who, after carrying the child for 9 months and developing a connection with the child, they refused to give the child back to the mother that originally was supposed to raise the child. Today, it will never happen. Today, all of there's very, very tight legal mechanisms which are made to ensure that whichever mother is initiating the process, she will never lose the child. So if you have, for example, a mother that is looking for an egg donor or a mother looking for a surrogate mother, in both cases, she will not lose the child.
All right, next question. If the egg donor or surrogate is Jewish and married, is the child a mamzer?
Right. Okay, that's also an excellent question. And this comes into the same argument that we spoke about in the middle of my presentation, whether you can have a mamzer without relationship. And even though, in retrospect, post factum, I've said before that my very strong opinion is that child will not be a mamzer without relationship. But because we do not want to create a situation of a person who is a mamzer, according to even some opinions, when we guide the couples that are insistent on going through getting an egg donor, we're guiding them to, if they want a Jewish egg donor, we make sure, I'll tell you something interesting, I didn't discuss it, but now that you mentioned it, some couples want a Jewish egg donor. So I work with certain agencies around the world that actually allow me, because it's a little bit different legally. An egg donor is anonymous, according to most laws of most in America and Australia. Now in America, the couple cannot know who the egg donor is. So a surrogate mother, yes, but an egg donor, no. And what happens is that I work with agencies, both dealing with surrogate mothers and egg donors, where they allow me to be able to certify them as being Jewish. So the same way as I help couples who are getting married to certify, to make sure they're kosher to get married, I work with agencies where a potential egg donor would fill out the form, and she will go through the same process as if she's getting married, and I would certify her in exactly the same way, and I would make sure that part of the protocol of the IVF is that on the day of egg retrieval, she would be identified as being the egg donor that we have certified as being Jewish. So it's it is possible to have egg donors and surrogate mothers as, certified as being Jewish and kosher for that, but we have to approve them. That's how I work with dozens of couples. Now, when they're looking for a donor, we tell the couple not to take, number one, somebody like a sister-in-law. Some women say, I have a sister, she wants to donate an egg. As they're very excited about it because it's similar genetics, close to home. We don't allow it for many reasons, because at least according to some opinions, there is a question of being a mamzer, because the husband is having a child with his wife's sister. So that's something which we don't allow. We don't allow a woman who's married chuppah kedushin, who's married according to Jewish law, to be an egg donor for another woman. I remember that many years ago there was a doctor who's since then retired who asked me to be in a particular forum of an ethical committee that he established for all these questions. And I remember that people were asking, can the grandmother be the surrogate mother? Can they, to me, even if you're talking about non-Jewish law, like you're talking about Jewish, like non-Jewish people, it didn't sit well with me that there should be such a lack of clarity that you don't know, this lady your grandmother or your mother? Is this lady your aunt? It's too close to home and creates a confusion for the kids. So even from a Jewish point, it's certainly a very, very big problem. But even from a secular perspective, I believe there are very, very major ethical issues.
All right, next question. With the story with the Kohen and the PGD, someone is asking, was PGD allowed to choose girl for the Kohen in the end?
Yes, in this case, it was allowed because of the very sensitive situation.
All right. And they're also asking if you can discuss PGD in depth on another shiur.
I will discuss that, but what I'd like, if possible, I'm thinking very much that in future to dedicate large portions of sessions to questions. And I would like you to assist me in that. I would like I'm going to have Aaron Sirota. He will create a forum where questions can go throughout the week. Like you can keep on asking questions, and we'll choose the questions. I mean, we won't be able to cover all of them in 1 week, but we're going to try to cover them eventually, and we're going to address them properly at certain sessions. So if you do have questions about PGD, I really would like to discuss it. It's a very fascinating topic, but I would appreciate at this point to have more and more questions coming through.
All right. Someone's asking, so is it best to have two Jewish mothers for egg and uterus? Is that the best case?
if you can guarantee that there will be no halachic questions which I mentioned before, then obviously once there's a Jewish donor, whether egg donor or a surrogate mother, then it would take away the need for conversion and so on and so forth. But you must cover all of those points. In other words, it's either you cover them or it's not worth it, because you can create more problems than you solve.
All right. Next question. What is the status of a child adopted at birth by Jewish parents if the child born is not Jewish?
If a child is adopted, the child has to be converted. The child will not be Jewish, for sure. It's not even a question. Over here we're talking about a possible 50-50 doubt. When the child was adopted, he has to go to conversion, and conversion means he has to be circumcised, and he has to be, if it's a boy, obviously, and immersed in the mikveh with a beis din.
All right. Next question. Someone is saying thank you for such an extremely difficult topic. And they're asking, if the surrogate is a Jewish woman, but the child was of a non-Jewish genetic material and grew up in a non-Jewish home, after her conversion, would the person receive a Jewish status?
Can you? I want to understand the question again. Can you repeat it? Who is raising the child?
Again, I'll do it so. If the surrogate is a Jewish woman,
okay,
but the child was of a non-Jewish genetic material and grew up in a non-Jewish home.
Right.
So after their conversion, would the person receive a Jewish status?
Okay, I think I understand the question. You're asking...
so they're saying non-Jews are raising the kid, but then the kid did a gear. Right.
It's a very interesting question, which is probably more theoretical than practical, because I suppose it is possible that in a regular situation, a Jewish woman decided to be a surrogate. She had no idea what's right, what's wrong. And by the way, I am asked once in a while those questions by Jewish women. I was asked once by a Jewish girl in America. She wanted to go through college. In America, they pay a lot of money. In Australia, it's legal to pay for eggs. In America, you can get a lot of money for it. And she says, look, I can become a donor. And could I earn money by doing that? And I told her not to do it for a number of reasons. One reason is more general, but a more blatant reason is that if she becomes a general donor to a non-Jewish couple, then it's a possible situation where a Jewish child, because like I said before, there's a possibility of a child being Jewish, is growing up completely without knowing that he's Jewish. Like we discussed in the very first lecture, Tinnik Shenishba, child who was, so to speak, kidnapped from his source, and he doesn't even know that he's Jewish. And that's something which is very big wrong to do. And the same thing applies for a woman who just wants to offer to be a surrogate mother. She's a Jewish lady, and she could be a surrogate mother for anybody. That's wrong, because at the end of the day, her child will grow with a non-Jewish couple. If this happens, if the child grows up and wants to convert, he could convert, but we wouldn't convert him at that point, because there has to be at least the foundation that is growing in a home that will give him Jewish identity. If he's growing up in a non-Jewish home, even if we found out about such a situation, if the surrogate mother would, so to speak, realize what she's done, and she will walk over to us and say, listen, I was a surrogate mother for this child who is from non-Jewish biological parents, we wouldn't convert such a child, because the child would not he would not grow up with a Jewish identity, and he wouldn't marry a Jew. It would create further challenges and obstacles for the Jewish people, and therefore we wouldn't convert such a child unless they grow up and convert themselves.
All right, next question, final question, because I think we've run out of time. Someone is asking.
By the way, I just want to say that if we can record the questions that weren't answered, maybe I could answer them in the future. So even if I can't answer everything now, I can address them in the future. We can.
So I was about to write. I wanted to let everyone know we're opening for now until Rabbi Ulman's website is completely finished. We're going to have a tab on chabadofbondi.com for questions for this lecture. So if you have any follow-up questions and things like that
on previous lectures,
any lectures that Rabbi Ulman has given, or any questions that you have generally about halacha. So you can definitely send it through, and we will look it over, and Rabbi Ulman will do his best to try and answer as many questions as possible. So for the final question today, someone is asking, are Jewish women encouraged to become surrogate mothers?
No. Something we wouldn't encourage in the first place, because ultimately it's something that we allow when it's already a fait accompli, but to encourage it means introducing a lot of potential problems that you don't know in advance if you're able to always to fix it, because you need always the cooperation of all the people in order to be able to make sure everything goes right. So in the first place, we don't encourage any of this, but we understand people's challenges, we understand people's emotions, and we understand that people, the desire to have children is a very, very fundamental desire, and therefore we will always talk to anybody, no matter what question comes up. Ladies and gentlemen, I very much hope that I will get some questions, and we'll announce what's going to happen next Tuesday. In the meantime, I want to wish all of you a very, very happy Yontif of Shavuos, and keep safe and keep well. All the very best. Kol tov.